The energy was soundless and smooth. There was no sputter, no fireworks. It glowed with a soft, pure white light, almost caressing the metal panels of the door, but not even beginning to sear them. Minute after minute, the dogged Farah refused to believe the incredible failure and played the boundlessly potent energy on that resisting wall. When he finally shut off his machine, he was perspiring freely. I don't understand it. Why, no metal is supposed to stand up against a steady flood of atomic force. Even the hard metal plates used inside the blast chamber of a motor take the explosions in what is called infinite series. So that each time, one has unlimited rest. That's the theory. But actually, steady running crystallizes the whole plate after a few months. The weapon shops are big. They spread right through the Empire, and they don't recognize the Empress. Farah shifted his feet on the hard grass, disturbed. He didn't like this kind of talk. It sounded sacrilegious, and besides, it was nonsense. It must be. Before he could speak, a man said somewhere behind him, I've heard it said that the door will only open to those who cannot harm the people inside. The words shocked Farah out of his daze, and with a start, and for the first time, he saw his failure had a bad psychological effect, and he said sharply, That's ridiculous. If there were doors like that, we'd all have them. The thought that stopped his words was the sudden realization that he had not seen anybody try to open the door. And with all his reluctance around him, it was quite possible that he stepped forward, grasped the doorknob, and pulled. The door opened, with an unnatural weightlessness that gave him the fleeting impression that the knob had come loose into his hand. With a gasp, Farah jerked the door open, wide open. Jor! He yelled. Get in! The constable made a distorted movement, distorted by what had been a will of caution, and followed by the instant realization that he could not hold back before so many. He leaped awkwardly toward the open door, and it closed in his face. Farah stared stupidly at his hand, which was still clenched, and then slowly a hideous thrill coursed along his nerves. The knob had withdrawn, it had twisted, become vicious, slipped amorphously from his straining fingers. Even the memory of that brief sensation gave him a feeling of unnormal things. He grew aware that the crowd was watching with a silent intentness. Farah reached again for the knob, not quite so eagerly this time, and it was only a sudden realization of his reluctance that made him angry when the handle neither turned nor yielded in any way. Determination returned in full force. Go back, Jor, while I pull. The man retreated, but it did no good. Tugging did not help. The door would not open. And somewhere in the crowd, a man said darkly, It decided to let you in. Then it changed its mind. What foolishness are you talking? It changed its mind. Are you crazy? A door has no common sense. But a surge of fear put a half quaver in his voice. It was the sudden alarm that made him bold beyond all his normal caution. And with a jerk of his body, Farah faced the shop, and the building loomed there under the night sky, in itself bright as day, huge in width and length, alien, menacing, no longer easily conquerable. And the dim, queasy wonder came as to what the soldiers of the Empress would do if they were invited to act. And suddenly, a bare flashing glimpse of a grim possibility. The feeling grew that even they would be able to do nothing. Abruptly, Farah was conscious of horror, that such an idea could enter his mind. He shut his brain tight, said wildly, The door opened for me once, it will open again. Farah, don't be a fool. What will you even do inside? Said the mayor. Farah was vaguely amazed to realize that he had stepped across the threshold. He turned, startled, stared at the blur of faces. Why, I planned to buy a gun, of course. The brilliance of his reply, the cunning implicit in it, it dazzled Farah for half a minute longer, and the mood yielded slowly as he found himself in the dimly lighted interior of the weapons shop. It was preternaturally quiet inside. Not a sound penetrated the night. And Farah walked forward gingerly on a rugged floor that muffled his footsteps utterly. After a moment, his eyes accustomed themselves to the soft lighting, which came like a reflection from the walls and the ceiling. In a vague way, he had expected ultra-normalness, and the ordinariness of the atomic light acted like a tonic to his tense nerves. He shook himself angrily. Why should there be anything really superior? He was himself angry. It was a shop, almost scantily furnished. There were no showcases on the walls and on the floor. Glitteringly lovely things, but nothing unusual. Not many of them either, only a few dozen. There was in addition a double ornate door leading to the back room. Farah tried to keep one eye on that door, as he examined several showcases, each with 3 or 4 weapons either mounted or arranged in boxes or holsters. Abruptly, the weapons began to excite him. He forgot to watch the door as the wild thought struck that he ought to grab one of those guns from a case, and then the normal someone came. "You wish to buy a gun?" Farah turned with a jump. Brief rage flooded him at the way his plan had been wrecked by the arrival of the clerk. The anger died as he saw the intruder with a fine-looking silver-haired man, older than himself. That was immeasurably disconcerting. Farah had immense and almost automatic respect for age. For a long second, he could only stand there gaping. He said at last, Yes, a gun. For what purpose?" Farah could only look at him blankly. It was too fast. He wanted to get mad. He wanted to tell these people what he thought of them. But the age of this representative locked his tongue, tangled his emotions. He managed his speech only by an effort of will. "For hunting. Yeah, definitely for hunting. There's a lake north of here." And he stopped, scowling, startled at the extent of his dishonesty. He was not preparing to scowl, only go so deeply into provocation. Then he said curtly, "Yeah, for hunting." Abruptly, he hated the man for having put him so completely at a disadvantage. With smoldering eyes, he watched the old fellow click open a showcase, take out a few green shining rifles. And as the man faced him, weapon in hand, Farah was thinking grimly, pretty clever, having an old man as a front. It was the same kind of cunning that had made them choose the property on Miser Harris. Icily furious, taut with his purpose, Farah reached for the gun, but the man held it out beyond his reach. "Before I can let you test this, I'm compelled by the laws of the weapon shop to inform you under what circumstances you may purchase a gun. We weapons makers," the clerk said mildly, "have evolved guns that can, in their particular ranges, destroy any machine or object made of what is called matter. Thus, whoever possesses one of our weapons is the equal, more of any soldier of the Empress. I say more, because each gun is the center of a field of force which acts as a perfect screen against immaterial destructive forces. That screen offers no resistance to clever spears or bullets, or other material substances, but it would require a small atomic cannon to penetrate the superb barrier it creates around its owner. You will readily comprehend," the man went on, "that such a potent weapon could not be allowed to fall, unmodified, to irresponsible hands. Accordingly, no gun purchased from us may be used for aggression or murder. In the case of the hunting rifle, only such specified game birds and animals as we may from time to time list in our display window may be shot. Finally, no weapon can be resold without our approval. Are all these things clear?" Farah nodded dumbly. For the moment, speech was impossible to him. The incredible, fantastically stupid words were still going round and around in his head, and he wondered if he ought to laugh out loud or curse the man for daring to insult his intelligence so tremendously. So the gun mustn't be used for murder, robbery, so only certain birds and animals could be shot. And as for the reselling it, suppose he bought this thing, took a trip off 1,000 miles, offered it to some wealthy stranger for 2 credits. Who would ever know? Or suppose he held up the stranger, shot him. Who would the weapon ever find out? And the thing was so ridiculous that he grew aware that the gun was being held out to him, stock first. He took it eagerly, and had to fight the impulse to turn the muzzle directly on the old man. Mustn't rush, he thought. How does it work? You simply aim it and pull the trigger. Perhaps you would like to try it on a target. Yes. He swung the gun up, triumphantly. And you're it. Now, get over there to the front door and then outside. And if anybody's thinking of coming through the back door, I've got that covered too. He motioned jerkily at the clerk. Quick now, move! I'll shoot. I swear I will. I had no doubt you would. When we decided to attune the doors so that you could enter despite your hostility, we assumed the capacity for homicide. However, this is our party. You had better adjust yourself accordingly. And look behind you. There was silence. Fingers on trigger. Farr stood motionless. Dim thoughts came of all the half-things he had heard in the days before the weapons shops. They had secret supporters in every district. They had private and ruthless hidden governments, and that once you got in their clutches, the only way out was death. But what finally came clear was a mind picture of himself, Farr Clark, family man, faithful subject of the Empress, standing here in this dimly lighted store, deliberately fighting an organization so fast and menacing that he must have been mad. Only here he was, and he forced courage into his sagging muscles, and he said, "You can't fool me with pretending there's someone behind me. Now get to that door and fast." The firm eyes of the old man were looking past him, and the man said quietly, "Well, Rad, have you all the data?" "Enough for a primary," said a young man's baritone voice behind Farah. "Type A7 conservative, good average intelligence, monastic, development peculiar, seems like a small town, one-sided outlook fostered by the imperial school's present and exaggerated form. He's extremely honest. Reason would be useless, sir. Emotional approach would require extended treatment. I see no reason why we should bother. Let him live his life as it suits him." "If you think that the trick voice is going to make me turn, you're crazy. That's the left wall of a building. I know there's no one there." "I'm in all favor, Rad. We should let him live his life. But he was the prime mover of the crowd outside. I think he should be discouraged." "We'll advertise his presence," said Rad. "He'll spend the rest of his life denying the charge." Farr's confidence in the gun had faded so far that he listened in puzzled uneasiness to the incomprehensible conversation. He forgot it completely. His lips parted. Before he could speak, the old man cut in persistently. "I think a little emotion might have a long-run effect. Show him the palace." "Palace?" The startling words tore Farr out of his brief paralysis. "See here! I can see now you lied to me. This gun isn't loaded at all." His voice failed him. Every muscle in his body was rigid. He stared like a madman. There was no gun in his hands. "Why you—" he began wildly and stopped again. His mind heaved with imbalance. With a terrible effort, he fought off the spinning sensation, thought finally, tremblingly, somebody must have sneaked the gun from him. That meant there was someone behind them. And the voice was no mechanical thing. Somehow they had... He started to run. He started to turn. He couldn't. When the name of... He struggled, pushing his hands with his muscles. Couldn't move. Couldn't budge. Couldn't even... The room was growing curiously dark. He had difficulty seeing the old man. he would have shrieked then if he could, because the weapon shop was gone. He was standing in the sky above an immense city. And in the sky, and nothing beneath him, nothing around him but air. And the blue summer heaven and the city a mile or 2 miles below. Nothing. Nothing. He would have shrieked, but his breath seemed solidly embedded in his lungs. Sanity came back as a remote awareness impinged upon his terrified mind. He was actually standing on hard floor. The city must be a picture somehow focused directly into his eyes. For the first time with a start, Farah recognized the metropolis below. It was the city of dreams, the imperial city, capital of the glorious Empress Ishur. From his great height, he could see the gardens, the gorgeous grounds of the Silver Palace, the official imperial residence office. The last tendrils of his fear were fading now before it, gathering fascination and wonder. And they vanished utterly as he recognized with a ghastly thrill of uncertain expectancy that the palace was drawing nearer at great speed. Show him the palace. Did that mean? Could it mean? That spray of tense thoughts splattered into non-existence as a glittering roof flashed straight at his face. He gulped at the solid metal of it. It passed through him, then other walls and ceilings. His first sense of imminent, mind-shaking desecration came as the picture paused in a great room where a score of men sat around a table at the head of which a young woman, the inexorable, sacrilegious, limitlessly powered cameras that were taking the pictures, swung across the table and caught the woman full face. It was a handsome face, but there was passion and fury twisting it now, and the very blaze of fire in her eyes. She leaned forward, said in a voice at once familiar. How often Farah had heard its calm, measured tones on telestats. Distorted, utterly distorted by anger and insolent certainty of command. That caricature of a beloved voice slashed across the silence as clearly as if he, Farah, were in that room. The picture snapped off instantly. It was swift as that, and Farah was back in the weapons shop. He stood for a moment swaying, fighting to accustom his eyes to the dimness, and his emotions were contempt at the simpleness of the trickery. A motion picture. What kind of a fool did they think he was, to swallow something as transparently unreal as that? He'd, abruptly, the appalling lechery of the scheme, the indescribable wickedness of what he was being attempted here, brought red rage. Why, you scum. You've got something to act the part of the Empress. Trying to pretend that... Why, you... That will do, said the voice of Rad, and Farah shook as a big young man walked into his line of vision. And the alarmed thought came that people would besmirch so vilely the character of Her Imperial Majesty, would not hesitate to do physical damage to Farah Clark. And the young man went on in a steady tone. We don't pretend that what you saw was taking place this instant in the palace. That would be too much of a coincidence. But it was taken 2 weeks ago. The woman is the Empress. The man whose death she ordered is one of her many former lovers. He was found murdered 2 weeks ago. His name, if you care to look it up in the news files, Banton McCready. However, let that pass. We're finished with you now. But I'm not finished. I've never heard or seen so much infamy in all my life. If you think this town is through with you, you're crazy. We'll have a guard on this place day and night. Nobody will get in or out. That will do. It was a silver-haired man. Farah stepped out of the respect for age. The old man went on. The examination must have been interesting. As an honest man, you may call on us if you are ever in trouble. That's all. Leave through the side door, please. And it was all. Impalpable forces grabbed him, and he was shoved at a door that appeared miraculously in the wall, where seconds before the palace had been. And he found himself standing dazedly in a flower bed. And there was a swarm of men to his left, and he recognized his fellow townsmen that he was outside. The incredible nightmare appeared to be over. But Farah thought his reputation, not that his was a great name, but he had long believed with a quiet pride that Farah Clark Motor Repair Shop was widely known in the community and the countryside. And after that night, he slept poorly. There were days, then, when the conviction that this was a personal fight between himself and the weapon shop lay heavily on Farah. And grimly, thought it was out of his way, he made a point of walking past the weapon shop, always pausing to speak with Constable Jor. And on the fourth day, the policeman wasn't there. Farah waited patiently at first, and then angrily. Then he walked hastily to his shop and called Jor's house. No, Jor wasn't home. He was guarding the weapons store. Farah hesitated. His own shop was piled with work. He had a guilty sense of having neglected his customers for the first time in his life. It would be simple to call up the mayor and report of Jor's dereliction. And yet, he didn't want to get the man into trouble. Out in the street, he saw that a large crowd was gathering in front of the weapons shop. Farah hurried. A man he knew greeted him excitedly. George's been murdered, Farah. Murdered? Farah stood shocked still, and at first he was not nearly conscious of the grisly thought that was in his mind. Satisfaction. Flaming satisfaction. Now, he thought, even the soldiers would have to act. With a gasp, he realized the ghastly tenor of his thought. He shivered, and finally pushed the sense of shame out of his mind. He said slowly, "Where's the body?" "Inside." "You mean those scum?" In spite of himself, he hesitated over the epithet. Even now, it was difficult to think of the fine-faced, silver-haired old man in such terms. And abruptly, his mind hardened. He flared. "You mean those scum actually killed him, then pulled his body inside? Nobody saw the killing, but he's gone. Has been seen for 3 hours. The mayor got the weapons shop on the telestat. But they claim they don't know anything. They've done away with him, that's what. And now they're pretending innocence." He didn't recognize the emotions of the full-flowing joy that comes to a member of a mob, but his voice shook as he said, "Guns? Yes, that will be the answer. And the soldiers will have to come, of course. Here comes the mayor. Mr. Mayor, where are the atomic cannons due?" It's more than the same in the general meeting as the mayor's sleek purpose car landed slightly. Farr shook his head, puzzled at the glare, and then astoundingly, Mayor Dale pointed a finger at him. He said in a voice that trembled, "There's the man! There's the man who's responsible for the trouble that's come upon us. Stand forward, Farah Clark. Show yourself. You've cost this town 700 credits that we could ill afford to spend. We all know that it wasn't wise to interfere with these weapon shops, so long as the imperial government leaves them alone. What right have we to set up guard and act against them? That's what I thought from the beginning, but this man, this Farah Clark, kept after us all, forcing us to move against our wills, so that now we've got 700 credit bill to meet. I might as well make it brief. When I called the garrison, the commander laughed and said that Jor would turn up. I barely disconnected when there was money called from he's on Mars. It'll take 3 weeks for him to come back by ship, and we've got to pay for it. And Farah Clark is responsible." The shock was over. Farah stood cold. courthouse was big. It was a gray building. Farah felt emptier and colder every second as he walked along the gray corridors. In Glay, his decision not to give himself into the hands of a bloodsucker of a lawyer had seemed a wise act. Here in these enormous halls and palatial rooms, it seemed the sheerest folly. He managed nevertheless to give an articulate account of the criminal acts of the bank, first giving Cale the money, then turning over the note to its chief competitor, apparently within minutes of his signing of it. And he finished with, "I'm certain, sir, I'm sure, sir, the Empress would not approve of such goings-on against honest citizens." "How dare you?" said the cold-voiced creature behind the bench. "How dare you use the name of our Holy Master in support of your own gross self-interest?" Farah shivered. The sense of being intimately a member of the Empress's great human family yielded to a sudden chill, and a vast mind picture of the 10 million icy courts just like this, and the myriad of malevolent and heartless men like this, who stood between the Empress and her loyal subject, Farah. He thought passionately, if the Empress knew what was happening, how unjustly I was being treated. He pushed through the crowd, terrible doubt out of his mind, and it came in a hard reverie with a start. He heard Cardi saying, "Plaintiff's appeal dismissed, with cost assessed at 700 credits, to be divided between the court and the defense solicitor in the ratio of 5 to 2. See to it that the appliant does not leave until the costs are paid. Next case." Farah went alone the next day to see Creel's mother. He called first at Farmer's Restaurant at the outskirts of the village. The place was, he noted with satisfaction in the thought of the steady stream of money flowing in, half full. It was only mid-morning. Madame wasn't there. Tried the feed store, he thought. He found her in the back of the feed store, overseeing the weighing out of grain. And the hard-faced old woman heard his story without nothing a word. Finally, she said surtly, "Well, there's nothing doing, Farah. I'm the one who has to make loans often from the bank to swing deals. I've tried to set you up in business. I'd find the automatic atomic repair people getting after me. And besides, I'd be a fool to turn money over to a man who lets a bad son squeeze a fortune out of him. Such a man who has no sense about worldly things. And I won't give you a job because I don't hire relatives in my business. Ted Creel, to come live at my house. I won't support a man, though, that's all. Why don't you go to the weapon shop? You haven't anything to lose, and you can't go on like this." Farah went out, a little blindly. At first, the suggestion that he buy a gun and commit suicide had no real personal application. But he felt immeasurably hurt that his mother-in-law should have made it. Kill himself? Why? It was ridiculous. He was still only a young man going on 50. Given the proper chance, with his skilled hands, he could wrest a good living even in a world where automatic machines were encroaching everywhere. There were always room for a man who did a good job. His whole life had been based on that credo. Kill himself? He went home to find Creel packing up. "Well, it's the common sense thing to do. We'll rent the house and move into rooms." He told her about her mother's offer to take her in, watching her face as he spoke. Creel, his wife, shrugged. "Well, I told her no yesterday. I wonder why she mentioned it to you." And Farah walked swiftly over to the great front window overlooking the garden with its flowers, its pool, its rockery. He tried to think of Creel away from this garden of hers, this home of 2/3 a lifetime, Creel living in rooms. He knew what her mother had meant. There was one more hope. He watched till Creel went upstairs, then called Mel Dale on the telestat, and the mayor's plump face took on an uneasy expression as he saw who it was. He listened pontifically and said finally, "I'm sorry. The council does not loan money. And I might as well tell you, Farah, I have nothing to do with this. But you can't get a license for a shop anymore. What? I'm sorry. Listen, Farah, take my advice. Go to the weapon shop. These places have their uses, son. And there was a click. Farah sat staring at the blank face of the viewing screen. So it was to be death. Back at the weapon shop, it's Mr. Clark. Oh, what can I do for you, son? A faint flush crept into Farah's cheeks. In a dim fashion, he had hoped that he would not suffer the humiliation of being recognized. But now that his fear was realized, he stood his ground stubbornly. The important thing about killing himself was that there would be no body for Creel to bury at great expense. Neither knife nor poison would satisfy that basic requirement. I want a gun that can be adjusted to disintegrate a body 6 feet in diameter. Have you that kind? And without a word, the old man turned to his showcase and brought forth a sturdy gem of a revolver that glinted with all the soft colors of inimitable Ordine plastic. The man said in a precise voice, "Notice the flanges on this barrel. A little more than bulges. This makes the model ideal for carrying in a shoulder holster, and the coat can be drawn very swiftly because when properly attuned, it will leap toward the reaching hand." The speed of the draw was absolutely amazing. The old man's fingers moved, and the gun 4 feet away was in them. There was no blur of movement. It was like the door of the night that had slipped from Farah's grasp and slammed noiselessly in Constable Jor's face. Instantaneous. Farah, who had parted his lips as the old man was explaining the protest, the utter needlessness of illustrating any quality of the weapon except what he asked for, closed them again, and he stared in a brief dazed fascination, and something of the wonder that was here held in his mind and his body. He had seen her handle the guns of soldiers, and they were simply ordinary metal or plastic things. With a start, Farah remembered his purpose, and he smiled wryly and said, "Well, all this is very interesting. But what about the beam? Can that fan out?" "At a pencil's thickness. And at a pencil's thickness, this beam will pierce any body, except certain alloys of lead, up to 400 yards. With proper adjustment to the firing nozzle, it can disintegrate 6-foot object at 50 yards or less. The screw is the adjuster." "Well, I'll take it. I'll take the gun. How much is it?" He saw the old man was looking at him thoughtfully. "Well, I have previously explained our regulations to you, Mr. Clark. You recall them, of course." You mean those things actually apply? They're not. And with a terrible effort, he caught his spinning brain and blurring voice. Tense and cold, he said, "All I want is a gun that will shoot in self-defense, but which I can turn on myself if I have to, want to." "Oh," said the old man. He looked as if a great understanding suddenly dawned on him. "My dear sir, we have no objection to your killing yourself at any time. This is your personal privilege in a world where privileges grow scanter every year. As for the price of this revolver, it's 4 credits. "Only 4 credits? He stood absolutely astounded, his whole mind snatched from his dark purpose. Why, the plastic alone was... and the whole gun with its fine intricate workmanship. 25 credits would have been dirt cheap. He felt a brief thrill of utter interest. The mystery of the weapon shop suddenly loomed as vast and important as his own black destiny. But the old man was speaking again. "And if you will remove your coat, we can put on your holster." Quite automatically, Farah complied. It was vaguely startling to realize that in a few seconds he would be walking out of here, equipped with self-murder. There was now not a single obstacle to his death. And curiously, he was disappointed. He couldn't explain it, but somehow there had been in the back of his mind a hope that the shops might... What? What indeed? Farah sighed wearily. Perhaps you will prefer to step out of our side door. It's less conspicuous in the front. There was no resistance in Farah. He was dimly conscious of the man's finger on his arms, half guiding him, and then the old man pressed one of his several buttons on the wall so that it was done. And that was the door. He could see flowers beyond the opening. Without a word, he walked toward them. He was outside almost before he realized it. Farah stood for a moment in the neat little pathway, striving to grasp the finality of a situation. But nothing would come except a curious awareness of many men around him. For a long second, his brain was like a log drifting along a stream at night. And through the darkness grew a consciousness of something wrong. The wrongness was there in the back of his mind, and he turned leftward to go to the front of the weapons store. Vacantness transformed into a shock, startled sound, for he was not in the glade, and the weapons shop wasn't where it had been. In its place, a dozen men brushed past Farah to join a long line of men farther along, but Farah was immune to their presence, their strangeness. His whole mind, his whole vision, his whole very being was concentrating on the section of machine that stood where the weapons shop had been. A machine. His brain lifted up. But in his effort to grasp the tremendousness of the dull-metalled immensity of what was spread here under a summer sun beneath a sky as blue as a remote southern sea, the machine towered into the heavens. 5 great tiers of metal, each 100 feet high, and the superbly streamlined 500 feet ended in a peak of light, a gorgeous spire that tilted straight up a sheer 200 feet farther and matched the very sun for brightness. And it was a machine, not a building, because the whole lower tier was alive with shimmering lights, mostly green but sprinkled colorfully with red and occasionally blue and yellow. And twice as Farah watched green lights directly in front of him, they flashed unscintillatingly into red. And the second tier was alive with white and red lights, although there were only a fraction as many lights as the lowest tier. There was a sign how to read the lights. White, births. Red, deaths. Green, living. Blue, imagination. Yellow, immigration. And the numbers changed as he looked at them, leaping up and down, shifting below and above what they had been. People were dying, being born, moving to Mars, to Venus, to the moons of Jupiter, to Earth's moon. And others coming back again, landing minutes by minute in the thousands of spaceports. Life went on in its gigantic fashion. And here he was, the stupendous record. Here was, better get in line. Takes quite a while to push through an individual case, you know. You understand. And Farah just stared at the man. He had the distinct impression of having senseless words flung at him. In line? He stared and stopped himself with a jerk that hurt his throat. He was moving forward blindly ahead of the younger man, thinking a curious jumble about what must have been Constable Jor and how he had gotten to Mars, when another of the man's words penetrated. Case? Individual case? You must know why you're here. Surely. You wouldn't have been sent through there unless you had a problem of some kind that the weapons shop courts will solve for you. There's no other reason for coming to Information Center. Farah walked on because he was in line now. A fast-moving line that curved. So it was a building as well as a machine, he thought. A problem, he was thinking. Why, of course, he had a solution. A hopeless, insoluble, completely tangible problem, so deeply rooted in the basic structure of imperial civilization, the whole world would have been overturned to make it right. And with a start, he saw that he was at the entrance. And the odd thought came. In seconds, he would be committed irrevocably to what? Inside was a long, shining corridor. There's one that's practically empty. Just go. Farah walked ahead, and suddenly he was trembling. He was already noticing that at the end of each side hallway, there were some dozen young women sitting at desks, interviewing men. Good heavens, was it possible that all this meant? He grew aware that he had stopped in front of one of the girls. She smiled pleasantly. "Your name, please." "Thank you. It will take a few minutes to get your file. Won't you sit down?" He had noticed the chair. He sank information. "In effect, we are a bureau of statistics. Every person born registered here, their education, change of address, combination of unauthorized and unsuspected liaisons with imperial chambers of statistics through medium of agents in every community." It seemed to Farr that he was missing vital information. He couldn't understand her. "You will be interested to know that your own son, Cale, bribed himself into a commission in the Imperial Army, 5,000 credits. Huh. Now, I must inform you that the weapon shops take no action against individuals. Your son can have his job. The money he stole, we're not concerned with moral correction. That must come naturally from the individual, of course." Sweating, Ferris sank back into his seat. His mind was heaving. But what? How? "You will proceed now to name room. Watch for your name, and when it appears, go straight to room 474. Remember, 474. Now, the line is waiting on you, sir. Please." She smiled politely. Farr was moving off, almost before he realized it. He half turned to ask another question, but an old man was sinking into his chair. There was a sound. It was a colossal, incredible sound that he stopped short, just inside the door, shrinking back. He stood then, trying to blink sense into a visual confusion that rivaled in magnitude that incredible tornado of noise. Men. Men everywhere. Men by the thousands in a long, broad auditorium, packed into rows of seats, pacing with an abandon of restlessness up and down aisles, all of them staring with a frantic interest at a long board, marked off into squares, and each square lettered with the alphabet from A, B, C, so on to Z. This tremendous board with its list of names ran the full length of the immense room. And every few minutes, a great sign would flash along the board, telling everyone, "Watch for your initials." Abruptly, Farr looked at the screen, and he thought unsteadily, "Well, I'm not going to make a fool of myself." Then he read it. Clark, Farah, on the board. "Hey, that's me! That's me!" But no one turned. No one paid the slightest attention. Shamed, he slunk across the room where an endless line of men kept crowding into corridors beyond. And the silence in the long corridor was almost as shattering as the mind-destroying noise it replaced. It was hard to concentrate on the idea of a number, 474. It was completely impossible to imagine how he could lie beyond 474. But there he was. The room was small. It was furnished with a small business-type table. Out of its depths, a man's baritone voice said, "Farah? Clark?" "Yes?" "Before the verdict is rendered in your case, I want you to take a folder from the blue pile. The list will show the Fifth Interplanetary Bank in its proper relation to yourself and the world, and it will be explained to you in due course." The list Ferris saw was simply that, a list of the names of companies, names that ran A to Z. "It has been established that the Fifth Interplanetary Bank perpetrated upon you a gross swindle, and further, guilty of practicing scavengry, deception, blackmail, and accessory to chemical conspiracy. The bank made contact with your son through what is quite properly known as a scavenger." He couldn't get over the wonder of it. This great and fascinating organization established here in the very heart of a ruthless civilization. A civilization that had, in a few brief weeks, stripped him of everything he possessed. With a deliberate will, he stopped that glowing flow of thought. The judge. The judge said I would have to... And all of a sudden, the old man appeared. Before we go into that, I want you to examine the blue folder you brought with you. Folder? I don't understand. Are these the companies you have to act against? That's not what I mean. These firms constitute only a fraction of the 800,000 companies that are constantly in our books. These companies all know that. Because of us, their profits on paper bear no relation to their assets. In view of your past opinions on that subject, I do not expect you to believe me. Forrest stood as still as death, for he did believe, with unquestioning conviction, completely, finally. The amazing and unforgivable thing was that all his life he had watched the march of ruined men into the oblivion of poverty and disgrace. He blamed them, and Farr groaned. I've been like a madman. Everything for the Empress. Under no circumstances must you say anything against Her Majesty. The weapon shop will not countenance any such words, and will give no further aid to anyone who is indiscreet. Do you understand? Yeah. And going outside was like returning from life to death, from hope to reality. Farrell walked along the quiet streets of Clay, darkest night. For the first time it struck him that the weapon shop information center must be halfway around the world. For it had been a day, a brilliant day. The picture vanished if it had never existed, and he grew aware again, preternaturally aware of the village of Glay, asleep all around him. Silent, peaceful, yet ugly, he thought. Ugly with the ugliness of evil enthroned, he thought. He wiped his vision clear with the back of his hand, thought of Creel's long-dead father, and strode on without shame. The shop was the same. The hard metal padlock yielded before the tiny blazing supernal power of the revolver. One flick of fire, and the metal dissolved. He gulped with awful relief. For the machines, his precious tools that he had seen carted away within hours of the bailiff's arrival, were here again, ready for use. Shaky from pressure with his emotions, Farr called. No one answered. Morning came palely, but it was 10 o'clock before his shadow darkened and opened the door. Constable Jor. I've got orders here for your arrest. And tell those who sent you that I resist arrest with a gun. I have summons here ordering you to appear at the Great Court of Ferd this afternoon. Will you accept it? Certainly. Then you will be there. I'll send my lawyer. Just drop the summons on the floor there. Tell them I took it. Do not ridicule by word any legal measure of the imperial authorities. Simply disobey them. And Jor went out, and he seemed relieved.